These aren't movie scenes. These are real flights caught on camera when things went wrong. From a stall over a Taipei river to a collision on a Lima runway, we take a calm, deep dive into 9 documented disasters. We look past the terrifying images to reveal what the investigators found and how the rules of flying were rewritten. Real footage, real investigations. Welcome to Terra Obscura. The morning of TransAsia Airways Flight 235 did not feel like the start of a major disaster. It was a short domestic hop from Taipei Songshan Airport to Kinmen, a small island near the Chinese coast. The aircraft was an ATR-72, with 58 people on board and clear winter weather over the city. It was a route the crew had flown many times. Just after 10:50 in the morning, the aircraft lined up on runway 10 at Songshan, pushed its power levers forward, and began its takeoff roll. Passengers felt the familiar vibration of the turboprop engines and the quick acceleration of a regional takeoff. The runway sits right in the middle of Taipei. Beyond the airport fence are highways, apartment blocks, and the Keeling River. There is almost no open space if anything goes wrong. Liftoff felt normal. The ATR climbed away from the runway, gear coming up, flaps beginning their retraction. But in the cockpit, the first signs of trouble appeared within seconds. An intermittent fault in the automatic power and propeller system on the right engine triggered an uncommanded autofeather. In simple terms, the right engine stopped producing useful thrust even though its propeller was still windmilling. The airplane began to yaw and roll because the left engine was now pushing, while the right side was mostly drag. At this stage, a clear, methodical engine failure drill would have kept the situation under control. Instead, confusion and misidentification took over. The crew received warnings and indications suggesting a problem on the right side, but the pilot flying pulled back the power on the left engine, the only one still producing full thrust. Within a short time, that engine was actually shut down. The ATR was now climbing low over a dense city with both engines effectively lost, one because of a fault, the other because the crew had mistakenly cut it off. A stick shaker and other stall warnings began to sound as the speed bled away. The airplane's nose was still relatively high while the power available had collapsed. The turboprop entered a stall, no longer generating enough lift to stay flying. Instead of a smooth climb, the aircraft started to sink and roll. Below, drivers on an elevated highway were going about a normal day. Some of their cars had dash cameras recording the traffic. Those cameras suddenly captured something no one ever expects to see. The ATR came into view crossing the road at a steep left bank, wings nearly vertical, dropping toward the Keeling River. For a moment it hung there in the frame, a large plane sideways over a highway lined with cars and buses. Then the left wing hit. The wingtip and outer section sliced into a taxi and the edge of the bridge, tearing off metal and sending the vehicle spinning. The impact ripped part of the wing away and twisted the airplane even further. An instant later, the crippled turboprop rolled into the river beside the road, hitting the water inverted and breaking apart. The dashcam views end with a spray of water, flying debris, and the sudden loss of the airplane from the frame. In the cabin, there had been only seconds between a normal climb and the final impact. Passengers would have felt the unusual roll, heard stall warnings and engine noises change, and seen the city tilt outside their windows. Some were thrown from their seats as the airplane rolled and then hit the bridge and water. Inside, structures broke, seats tore loose, and water rushed into the fuselage. Rescue crews arrived quickly. The ATR had come down in a shallow section of the river, close to the bank and not far from the airport. Helicopters hovered above. Inflatable boats and divers moved around the partly submerged wreckage. Firefighters and soldiers worked from the bridge and riverbank, pulling survivors out through torn sections of the fuselage and bringing them ashore on stretchers and rafts. Images of a child being lifted from the wreckage and people standing on the overturned wing went around the world within hours. In total, 43 of the 58 people on board died. 15 survived with varying degrees of injury. On the ground, the taxi driver and passenger in the car that had been hit by the wing were injured but lived. The investigation that followed focused first on the engines and propeller systems, then on the crew's actions. Data from the flight recorders confirmed the sequence that the videos had only hinted at. A fault in the automatic system caused the right engine propeller to feather and stop producing thrust. Instead of carefully identifying the failed engine and keeping power on the good one, the pilots reduced power on the left engine and then shut it down completely. With the airplane low, heavy, and now essentially without thrust, the stall warnings were accurate. The turboprop was flying too slowly at too high an angle of attack. Control inputs from the pilot flying were often opposite to what the situation required. The stick pusher, designed to lower the nose and break the stall, was pulled against. The ATR rolled left more and more as the speed decayed. Investigators also looked at the wider context. Training records, checking standards, and previous issues at the airline showed a pattern of weak engine failure handling and inconsistent simulator practice. In response, authorities in Taiwan ordered major changes in training for turboprop crews, stricter proficiency checks, and new emphasis on basic stall recognition and recovery. The airline eventually ceased operations. China Airlines Flight 120 was the kind of flight where everyone thought the danger was over the moment the wheels touched down. On the 20th of August 2007, a Boeing 737 left Taipei for Naha Airport in Okinawa, Japan. On board were 165 people, 157 passengers, and 8 crew. The flight itself was uneventful. The jet approached Naha in daylight on dry pavement with normal visibility. The landing was smooth. The airplane rolled out along the runway and turned toward its assigned parking stand. Inside, passengers loosened seatbelts and reached for overhead bins. Some probably sent quick texts, planning the rest of their day on Okinawa. The feeling was simple. We landed, so we are safe. Under the right wing, something else was happening that nobody in the cabin could see. When the crew retracted the leading edge slats after landing, a small part deep inside the slat track assembly failed. A downstop piece and bolt on the number 5 slat track had already worked loose over time. As the mechanism moved, that loose metal was pushed through its housing and into the right main fuel tank. It punched a small hole in the tank structure. Through that hole, fuel began to leak inside the wing near engine 2. The crew did not see any fuel imbalance or warning that would clearly point to a leak. On the ramp, ground staff and tower controllers watched the jet roll slowly toward Spot 41, its designated stand away from the main terminal. The airplane came to a stop and the crew set the parking brake. The after-landing and shutdown flows began. Only then did people on the ground notice something was wrong. A member of the ground crew saw flames near the right engine and along the lower surface of the wing. Fuel leaking from the punctured area had reached hot engine parts or brakes and ignited. Almost immediately, the captain ordered an emergency evacuation. There was no time to wait for a jet bridge or stairs. In the cabin, passengers who had been half standing were suddenly told to leave everything and evacuate. Flight attendants shouted commands, opened exits, and armed slides. On the right side of the airplane, away from the visible fire, 4 exits were used. Slides inflated. People began sliding down to the apron, some in bare feet or socks, some still clutching handbags they had not meant to take. Video from airport cameras and news crews would later show a steady stream of passengers coming off the right side, while dark smoke thickened on the left. The evacuation moved quickly. All passengers and cabin crew got out using the slides. On the flight deck, the pilots stayed a little longer to complete shutdown steps and make sure no one was left behind. When they finally left, the cabin was already empty. They opened the cockpit side windows, threw out the escape ropes, and began to climb down. Seconds later, the fire reached a new stage. Fuel burning near the right engine and wing root heated the structure around the tanks. The leak was still feeding fresh fuel into the area. In one of the most replayed clips of the incident, the right wing suddenly erupts. There is a sharp blast, then a huge fireball that engulfs the wing and races across the top of the fuselage. The 737 becomes a torch in front of the stand, flames and thick black smoke shooting upward as firefighters race in from across the field. By that time, everyone on board is already off the airplane. 3 people from the flight and 1 ground worker suffer minor injuries, but there are no fatalities. Within minutes, the jet that had looked perfectly normal on rollout is reduced to a burned-out shell. Photos taken later show the fuselage melted and collapsed, with only parts of the structure still recognizable as a 737. Investigators found that the root cause lay in a combination of design and maintenance. The slat track assembly on that part of the wing used a downstop and bolt that could, under certain conditions, work loose. Once loose, those parts could move into a position where retraction forces would drive them through the thin wall of the slat track can and into the fuel tank. Over time, subtle signs of wear and movement were not properly recognized. Because the leak started late in the taxi and only became obvious when the airplane stopped, there was almost no chance for the crew to spot it from the instruments before the fire began.
Jeju Air Flight 2216 was supposed to be the end of a holiday. On 29th December 2024, a Boeing 737 left Bangkok in the middle of the night, heading for Muan International Airport in South Korea, with 181 people on board, 175 passengers, and 6 crew. It was a popular leisure route. Many people were coming home from trips to Thailand, tired and ready to land, not expecting anything more dramatic than a winter morning at a small regional airport. The flight toward Korea was uneventful. As dawn approached, visibility around Muan was good. There was no fog, no strong wind. On the surface, it looked like a simple arrival. But one detail mattered a lot. Muan is known for bird activity. In recent years, it had recorded more bird strikes than any other regional airport in the country. At 8:54 in the morning, air traffic control cleared Jeju Flight to land on runway. As the jet lined up on final, the tower warned the crew about birds near the approach path. A short time later, the pilots themselves reported seeing a flock below them. Then something went wrong very quickly. The cockpit voice and data recorders stopped at 8:58. 6 seconds later, the crew declared Mayday and began a go-around. They told the tower they could not land and needed to try again. One of the working theories, based on early evidence, is that a bird strike hit the right engine and caused a problem with the systems that control the landing gear. and possibly power. What is known is that the pilots were soon in a difficult situation. They were trying to get the airplane back on the ground with a reported landing gear problem, and at least one engine affected. They requested to land in the opposite direction, on runway 19, likely because it gave them a more suitable wind and approach profile for an emergency landing. The tower agreed. One restaurant owner on a rooftop began filming with his phone when he saw the jet approaching low and fast in an unusual attitude. His 54-second clip would later be seen all over the world. At 9:03, Jeju Air Flight came into view over the runway with its landing gear still up. In the video, the airplane appears nose-high, descending without wheels, its engine nacelles hanging close to the asphalt. As it touches down about 1,200 meters along the runway, a shower of sparks bursts from underneath as metal scrapes along concrete. The 737 slides on its belly with the nose still slightly raised. For a few seconds, the jet remains largely intact, skidding along the runway in a plume of smoke and sparks. If there had been nothing solid at the far end, it might have come to a violent but survivable stop. Instead, just beyond the runway's end, lies a raised earth berm holding a solid concrete structure, the antenna array for the instrument landing system's localizer. It is not a frangible fence or soft ground. It is a hard wall. In the phone video, you see the airplane sliding off the end of the runway and disappearing behind the berm. A split second later, the screen fills with orange and black. The engines smash into the concrete and earth and are driven deep into the structure. The front of the fuselage breaks open and tears apart. The tail, still moving, pitches over and comes to rest inverted on the far side of the berm. Fuel spilling from the torn wings ignites in an enormous fireball that climbs into the sky, sending thick black smoke up over the flat landscape. Inside the cabin, there is no time for an orderly evacuation. The forces of the impact throw passengers forward. Seats break, overhead bins collapse, and heavy objects fly through the cabin. The belly landing and first slide would already have injured many people. The final collision with the berm is catastrophic. Almost instantly, fire and toxic smoke pour into the fuselage, especially in the front and middle sections. Emergency services receive their first calls around 9:03. Firefighters, soldiers, and police rush to the scene, but the heat around most of the wreck is so intense that they cannot enter. They train hoses on the flames and attack the fire from multiple angles. It takes more than half an hour to fully extinguish the blaze. When rescuers finally reach the wreckage, they find that almost everyone has died where they sat. Only 2 people survive. The 2 flight attendants who had been strapped into the aft jump seats in the tail section. That part of the airplane, though inverted and crushed, remained just intact enough to shield them from the worst of the fire. Rescuers use hydraulic tools to free one of them, pinned under a cabinet, and pull both out alive. They are seriously injured and disoriented. Neither can clearly remember the moments after the belly landing. In total, 179 of the 181 occupants lose their lives. It becomes the deadliest civil aviation accident in South Korea's history. The government declares a national period of mourning. Families gather in a hangar at Muan, converted into a temporary morgue. Memorial altars go up in cities across the country. News channels replay the same short videos again and again. The belly first landing, the long trail of sparks, the sudden bloom of fire when the airplane hits the berm. Investigators recover both the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder. One is damaged, but enough information remains to reconstruct the final minutes. Early statements from the accident board confirm a bird strike and a belly landing with the gear still up. They also point to the fixed concrete structure in the overrun area as a key factor in the scale of the disaster, something that critics say should never have been built so close to the end of a runway. The exact chain of technical events and cockpit decisions is still being studied, and the final report has not yet been released. For now, Jeju Air Flight sits at the uneasy edge between what we know and what we are still trying to understand. For viewers, it is one of the most disturbing clips in modern aviation.
FedEx Express Flight 80 was the kind of flight most people never think about. A night cargo run with no passengers, just packages, and a small crew heading into a major airport before dawn. On March 23, 2009, a McDonnell Douglas MD-11 freighter was on the last leg of its route from Guangzhou, China, to Tokyo Narita in Japan. On board were just 2 pilots. In the holds below them were tons of cargo that needed to be in Tokyo in time for the morning sorting rush. It was early morning, just before local sunrise. The weather at Narita was marginal. Strong, gusty winds, low cloud, and reports of wind shear on final. The MD-11 descended toward Narita and was vectored for an approach to runway 34 left. In the cockpit, the crew briefed for a challenging landing. Other airplanes had already reported bumps and speed changes on short final. The wind was shifting quickly in strength and direction, something that matters a lot for a heavy, long-bodied airplane like the MD-11, which is known to be unforgiving if the touchdown is not controlled. Configured for landing, gear and flaps down, the freighter turned on to final and followed the electronic guidance toward the runway. The ground speed and indicated airspeed wobbled with each gust. The pilots worked the throttles and control column to keep the path stable. On the ground, airport security cameras pointed toward the runway recorded a grainy but clear view of the approach. In those last seconds, the airplane sank a little below the ideal glide path and then met a sudden change in wind. The descent rate increased. The crew tried to correct, but there was not much height left to work with. The MD-11 crossed the threshold, still fast but dropping quickly. Instead of a smooth flare and gentle touchdown, the jet hit the runway hard on its main landing gear. The impact was severe enough to compress the struts almost to their limits and kick the airplane back into the air. To anyone watching the video, it looks like a giant bounce. The freighter slams down, springs back up a few meters, then starts to come back down again, nose still relatively high. In the cockpit, the pilots had only a couple of seconds to decide whether to go around or try to salvage the landing. They did not add enough thrust or fully transition to a go-around. The left wing in particular took enormous stress. That is the moment when the security camera footage becomes unforgettable. On the second slam, the airplane snaps violently to the left. The left wing collapses and digs into the runway. The freighter yaws and rolls at the same time, and the whole aircraft flips over onto its back, sliding down the runway inverted. Sparks and debris trail behind it. Almost immediately, fuel from the ruptured tanks ignites, and a fireball and thick black smoke cover the upside-down fuselage as it skids and then comes to a stop in a mass of flame. Rescue crews at Narita moved out quickly, but the scene they faced was catastrophic. The MD-11 was upside down, its fuselage broken and burning fiercely. Getting close enough to attempt a rescue was extremely dangerous. Despite their efforts, both pilots were killed in the crash. There were no passengers, but the loss of the crew and the shocking nature of the video made Flight 80 headline news around the world. Investigators examined the flight recorders, weather data, and the structure of the wreckage. They confirmed that the airplane had encountered gusty conditions and likely wind shear on final approach. But the key factor was how the landing was flown, and how the MD-11 responded to the hard touchdown and bounce. The MD-11 has a relatively small tailplane and a long fuselage, which makes its pitch behavior during landing more demanding than some other wide bodies. If a pilot allows a high sink rate to develop close to the ground, the airplane can hit hard and bounce. If the second contact also occurs with a high rate of descent and an incorrect pitch attitude, the loads on the gear and wing structure can exceed the design limits very quickly. In earlier accidents and incidents involving MD-11s, similar hard landing bounce flip patterns had already been seen. On Flight 80, the crew did not fully execute a go-around after the initial hard touchdown. The throttles were advanced, but not enough and not quickly enough to recover a safe flight path. At the same time, the pitch inputs and control of the flare were not sufficient to arrest the descent before the second impact. The combination of a high gross weight, gusty winds, a high vertical speed at touchdown, and the MD-11's characteristics created a narrow window for recovery that closed in a matter of seconds. Red Wing's Flight 9268 was far from a standard passenger service. It was a quiet ferry flight, bringing a heavy Russian airliner home from maintenance in the Czech Republic. The cabin was empty, no passengers, just 8 crew members settling in for a routine landing on a snowy winter evening in Moscow. After the flight from the Czech Republic, the jet was cleared for approach at Vnukovo. The runway stretched over 3 kilometers. Under normal circumstances, more than enough room for an aircraft of this size, but conditions down below were tricky. A gusty crosswind was whipping across the tarmac, and the surface was slick from recent snow. On the security cameras, the landing lights emerged from the gray, looking just like any other routine arrival. The problems began in the last seconds before touchdown. The airplane crossed the threshold slightly fast and did not touch down near the very beginning of the runway. Instead, it landed around 900 to 1,000 meters down the strip, still moving at roughly 230 kilometers per hour. To make matters worse, only the left main landing gear firmly contacted the surface at first. The right gear did not compress enough to send the weight on wheels signal that many systems depend on. Inside the cockpit, the pilots did what crews are trained to do after landing on a slippery runway. They brought the thrust levers back and selected reverse, and they applied the brakes. But the airplane's systems did not fully respond the way they expected. On this model, the automatic spoilers and the full reverse thrust are only allowed when the system is sure that the airplane is really on the ground. That depends on the gear compressed signals from both sides. With the right main gear not properly detected as loaded, the system never fully armed the spoilers or reverse. To the pilots, it felt like the airplane simply was not slowing the way it should. In reality, a heavy jet was still streaking down a contaminated runway, with almost no help from the devices that normally kill lift and drag the airplane down. Seconds ticked by. The plane rolled past the touchdown zone, then past the midfield point. Speed was still high. The end of the runway was rushing closer. By the time the crew realized that their deceleration was nowhere near enough, there was too little distance left to recover. At the far end, the runway stops and the safety area and perimeter fence begin. Beyond that is an embankment and the busy M3 highway. Flight 9268 ran off the end, broke through the airport barrier, and dropped down the slope. As it hit the ditch and structures between the runway and the road, the airplane broke into three major pieces. The cockpit and forward fuselage were torn away and thrown onto the highway itself. Drivers on the M3 saw something almost impossible to process: a jet coming out of the airport at ground level, debris flying, then a section of fuselage and a wheel tumbling across the lanes. One dashcam captured the impact in a few seconds of shaky video, showing a burst of snow, dirt, and wreckage as the nose section slammed near the road. One motorist was seriously injured by a piece of landing gear that flew across his path. Back at the airfield, the rest of the aircraft came to rest just beyond the airport fence, broken and burning. Emergency services reached the wreckage quickly, but the forces involved in the overrun and breakup had been enormous. 5 of the 8 crew members, including the pilots, died. The remaining 3 were badly injured but survived. There were no passengers on board, which is the only reason the death toll was not far higher. Investigators later pieced together the chain of causes. They found that the plane had landed long and fast on a slippery runway in gusty crosswind. They confirmed that the right main landing gear, weight on wheels signal never registered properly, so the automatic systems did not deploy spoilers or give full reverse thrust even though the pilot selected it. They also found issues with the braking system and the logic that links the gear sensors to the reversers and spoilers, as well as questions about how quickly the crew realized their deceleration problem and whether a go-around should have been attempted earlier in the approach. The crash was not an isolated warning. Just days earlier, another Red Wings plane had also overrun a runway in a separate incident, raising serious concerns about the type's braking and reverse systems and their maintenance. After Flight 9268, Russian authorities issued directives to inspect and modify the 2204 fleet, focusing on the landing gear limit switches, brake controls, and reverser logic. Operators were told to pay close attention to crosswind landings, landing distances, and stabilized approaches on contaminated runways. Rusair Flight 9605 was a late-night domestic run that would never reach the gate. On June 20, 2011, an aging Soviet-era jet departed Moscow for Petrozavodsk in the Russian north. On board were 52 people, 43 passengers, and 9 crew. It was technically a summer night, but the weather at the destination was unforgiving. Low clouds, thick fog, and rain blanketed the rural airport, obscuring the heavy forests and the highway that ran just past the runway threshold. As they approached midnight, the crew prepared for a straight-in approach. The airport's landing aids were basic, requiring the pilots to rely on their instruments until the very last moment. But inside the cockpit, discipline was unraveling. Investigators later discovered the navigator had alcohol in his system, yet the captain allowed him to dominate the approach. The co-pilot, whose job was to monitor altitude and ensure safety, was effectively sidelined. This was not a coordinated team. It was a breakdown of authority. Outside, there was nothing but a wall of gray. Air traffic control warned that visibility was below the legal minimums and suggested a go-around. The prudent choice was to divert or hold. Instead, they pressed on. As the aircraft sank lower, the radio altimeter counted down the height, but no one reacted when they passed the decision altitude. This was the point of no return. If you cannot see the runway, you must climb away. They saw nothing. Yet, the descent continued. Flying blind, the crew tried to improvise. They used a satellite navigation unit not approved for this type of precision flying. It gave them a false sense of location, but it could not provide the only thing that mattered: visual contact with the ground. Below them, on the highway, unsuspecting drivers were moving through the mist. Above them, the jet crossed the last safe margin. 60 meters, then 40. There was still time to throttle up and escape, but nobody made the call. Seconds later, the aircraft clipped the treetops. The impact tore into the right wing, rolling the jet violently to the side. It struggled in the air for a few hundred meters before slamming into the intersection of the highway and the airport perimeter road, falling just 1 kilometer short of the runway. The fuselage shattered, scattering wreckage and fire across the road and into the nearby woods. For those on the ground, the plane seemed to materialize out of the fog with no warning. Emergency teams rushed to a chaotic scene of burning fuel and debris. Tragically, of the 52 souls on board, 47 perished. Only 5 survived the inferno. The investigation revealed a chilling truth. The aircraft was mechanically sound. The engines were running. The controls were responding. This was a classic case of controlled flight into terrain. A perfectly flyable jet was flown into the ground because the human element failed. The crew ignored weather limits, neglected standard procedures, and allowed a compromised navigator to steer them into disaster. The tragedy at Petrozavodsk forced a major reckoning in Russian aviation, accelerating the retirement of these older jets and imposing stricter rules on crew discipline. It remains a stark reminder that in aviation, the most critical component is often the decision to say no. Pegasus Airlines Flight 2193 was supposed to be one of the most ordinary trips in Turkey. An evening hop from Izmir to Istanbul. On the 5th of February 2020, a Boeing 737 left Izmir Airport for Istanbul Sabiha Gökçen. On board were 183 people, 177 passengers, and 6 crew. It was a busy domestic route, full of families, business travelers, and commuters who knew this flight number by heart. The first part of the trip was uneventful. The jet climbed, cruised toward Istanbul, and began its descent like hundreds of flights before it. Over the airport, the weather was not friendly. A thunderstorm was passing over the area. Heavy rain, low cloud, and strong, shifting winds sat over the field. Air traffic control was using runway 06, which points roughly northeast. The problem was the wind direction. It was blowing mostly from the west, almost from behind the arriving aircraft. That meant a strong tailwind on approach and landing. 2 flights before Pegasus 2193 had already gone around instead of landing, reporting difficult conditions on final. As Flight 2193 approached, the tower cleared it to land on runway 06 and reported winds from about 270 degrees, more than 20 knots with higher gusts. Translated into runway terms, that meant roughly a 19-knot tailwind component, almost double Pegasus Airlines' own limit for tailwind landings. It was the kind of information that should trigger a careful decision, go around, or ask for a different runway. The crew pressed on with the approach. The 737 broke out of the cloud and rain on final, lined up with the runway lights, and continued down. Flight data later showed that the approach was not fully stabilized. The aircraft was still relatively fast and slightly high as it crossed the threshold. In those conditions, the safe response is to reject the landing and try again. Instead, the crew attempted to salvage it. The touchdown came very late. Instead of making contact near the beginning of the 3,000-meter runway, the jet did not touch down until something like 2,000 meters past the threshold. That left only about 1,000 meters of wet concrete to bring a heavy 737 from landing speed to a stop, in the rain, with a strong tailwind pushing it along. The airplane's ground spoilers came up and the thrust reversers were deployed. But for several precious seconds, there was no strong manual braking. By the time full braking was applied, the distance left was small, and the stopping job was huge. From the cabin, passengers felt a hard landing, a long roll, and a growing sense that the airplane was still moving fast when it should almost be stopped. Outside, the lights at the far end of the runway were coming up quickly. The 737 did not stop in time. It ran off the end of runway 06, crossed the short paved overrun, and went down the embankment beyond. There is a drop of roughly 30 meters between the runway and the lower ground, near the perimeter road. As the jet left the concrete, it plunged down the slope, striking structures including the localizer antennas and a small building. The impact forces tore at the fuselage. The nose and front cabin section broke away from the center, and the tail separated from the rear fuselage. In a few seconds, the aircraft that had been a single tube became 3 large pieces scattered beyond the runway end, with smaller debris all around. One of the engines detached and caught fire. Inside, the experience was violent and confusing. Seats broke loose, overhead bins burst open, and passengers were thrown against the seat in front or into the aisle as the jet dropped off the end and slammed through the embankment. When the motion stopped, there was no longer a clear front-to-back feeling in the cabin. Some people looked out of the windows and saw only broken structure and mud. Others realized that the section they were in had torn away from the rest of the airplane. Despite the breakup, there was no immediate, uncontrollable fire in the cabin. That gave people a narrow window to escape. Passengers and crew opened doors and used the brakes in the fuselage as exits. In phone videos taken just after the crash, you can see people walking and running away over wet ground, while sirens and shouting fill the background. Firefighters attacked the engine fire and sprayed foam around the wreckage to prevent a larger blaze. 3 passengers did not survive their injuries. The other 180 occupants were taken to hospitals, 179 of them with some form of injury, ranging from minor cuts and bruises to serious fractures. It was the first fatal accident in Pegasus Airlines history, and it came less than a month after another 737 from the same airline had also slid off a runway at Sabiha Gökçen, though that earlier event had caused no casualties. The investigation focused on several linked factors. The weather placed the airport right under an active thunderstorm, with strong, gusty tailwinds on the landing runway. Air traffic control continued to use runway 06, even as winds turned unfavorable. and did not close the runway despite go-arounds by preceding flights. On the flight deck, the crew chose to continue the approach in tailwind conditions that exceeded company limits, did not achieve a properly stabilized approach, landed long and delayed maximum braking on a wet surface. Any one of these factors might have been survivable on its own. Together, they left almost no margin. LATAM Perú Flight 2213 began as a completely normal departure, but in a matter of seconds it turned into one of the most shocking runway collisions of recent years. On November 18, 2022, an Airbus A320 prepared to depart Lima for a short flight across Peru. It was a routine afternoon at the country's main airport, with passengers heading to the Andes for work and family visits. The crew lined up on the runway, ready for a completely normal takeoff. At the same time, on the ground side of the operation, an emergency drill was underway. Airport fire crews were practicing response procedures and had been cleared to move into position as part of that exercise. Several firefighting vehicles were driving along service roads and then toward the runway safety area. Exactly how their movement was coordinated and what clearances were given became the central question after what happened next. In the cockpit of Flight 2213, the crew received their takeoff clearance. The Airbus rolled forward, engines spooling up to takeoff thrust, acceleration building. From the cabin, it felt like any normal departure. The long, smooth push back into the seats. The runway lights flicking by faster and faster out the windows. Down the runway, though, something was very wrong. As the A320 approached rotation speed, at least one large airport fire truck, lights flashing, entered the runway from the left. To those watching the later release CCTV, the scene almost looks impossible. A modern passenger jet at full takeoff power and a heavy fire vehicle crossing its path at a 90-degree angle. There was no time for a rejected takeoff to save the situation. The Airbus continued its high-speed roll. The crew began to rotate, pulling the nose up. Just moments later, the left main landing gear and left wing struck the fire truck hard. The impact ripped the landing gear away and tore open the structure around the wing. The engine and lower wing area exploded in sparks and fire. On video, you see the truck disintegrate and the airplane's left side erupt into flame. The collision crippled the jet instantly. It never got fully airborne. Instead, it collapsed back onto the runway, sliding at high speed with its left wing and engine on fire. The nose gear failed, and the aircraft skidded down the pavement, trailing a plume of sparks, smoke, and burning fuel. Passengers inside were thrown around as the cabin tilted and the floor vibrated violently. When the wreckage came to a stop, the left side of the Airbus was engulfed in flames. Thick, black smoke began to rise. In the cabin, oxygen masks fell and lights flickered. Flight attendants immediately began an evacuation. Some exits were unusable because of the fire, others became the lifeline. Slides were deployed on the safe side of the airplane, and passengers rushed out, many filming with phones as they ran across the runway away from the burning jet. From the ground, other responders and airport staff watched in horror as the same type of fire trucks used for rescue had just been destroyed in the impact. 2 firefighters in the struck vehicle were killed. A third was seriously injured. Remarkably, everyone on board the Airbus survived the initial accident. There were serious injuries among passengers and crew, but no fatalities inside the aircraft. The images that went around the world were stark. Security camera footage of the exact moment of collision, the airplane's wing slicing through the fire truck, runway side videos of the A320neo sliding down the runway with its wing blazing, and phone clips of passengers escaping down slides with the burning jet behind them. Investigators quickly focused on the core question: how did a passenger jet cleared for takeoff and a fire truck end up on the same active runway at the same moment? The early findings pointed to coordination and communication failures between different parts of the airport system. The flight crew believed they had a clear runway and a valid takeoff clearance. The fire crews involved in a timed drill believed they were authorized to enter their planned route, which, in their understanding, brought them across or near the runway. Air traffic control procedures, phraseology, and the exact wording of clearances all came under intense scrutiny. The accident highlighted a risk that often sits in the background of runway operations, not just aircraft-aircraft conflicts, but conflicts between aircraft and ground vehicles. Airports are busy, complex environments, with maintenance trucks, inspection cars, and emergency vehicles moving around the same pieces of pavement that jets use for takeoff and landing. Strict procedures, crystal clear communication, and well-designed routes are all that separate routine operations from disaster. Ural Airlines Flight 178 became famous not because of a tragedy, but because of where it ended up, parked in the middle of a cornfield as if placed there by hand. On the morning of August 15, 2019, an Airbus A321 was scheduled to fly from Moscow Zhukovsky Airport to Simferopol in Crimea. On board were 233 people. It was a clear summer morning. The runway at Zhukovsky sits close to open land on the edge of the city, and initially, everything about the departure looked routine. The A321 lined up, the engines spooled up, and the takeoff roll began. In the cabin, passengers felt the familiar push back into their seats. Outside, the terminal and grass blurred by as the jet accelerated. Seconds later, the nose lifted, and the aircraft rotated into the climb. But just moments after liftoff, the flight path crossed a flock of gulls. Multiple birds were ingested into both engines simultaneously. Passengers heard dull thumps and felt sudden vibrations. In the cockpit, the pilots registered a surge and a catastrophic drop in power. Warnings lit up the dashboard. The aircraft was barely above the ground, heavy with fuel, and now effectively without thrust. In many bird strike incidents, one engine fails, while the other remains strong enough to carry the plane to safety. Here, both were compromised. One engine lost nearly all usable thrust, the other was vibrating severely, threatening total failure if pushed too hard. The pilots had only seconds to react. Turning back to the runway was impossible. They were too low, too slow, and too close to the airport boundary. Trying to climb and circle would mean stalling a crippled jet over a populated area. The captain made a split-second decision. Keep the nose down to preserve speed, keep the wings level, and land straight ahead. Directly in front of them lay a vast agricultural area, specifically a thick cornfield. Contrary to standard procedure for some landings, the pilots chose to keep the landing gear retracted. Lowering the wheels in soft soil could have caused them to dig in, potentially flipping the aircraft or tearing it apart. They shut off the fuel and focused on a controlled impact. Less than a minute after takeoff, the A321 returned to Earth. Inside the cabin, passengers watched the ground rising fast. Rows of tall corn rushed toward the windows. There was no time for a calm announcement. The impact was heavy, but not violent in the way a high-speed crash is. The aircraft settled onto its belly, sliding smoothly over the vegetation as the stalks flattened under the fuselage. The motion slowed, then stopped. The wings remained attached, the fuel tanks held. Aside from the popping of overhead bins and dust filling the air, the cabin remained intact. There was no explosion. The A321 sat in the middle of the field, slightly nose up, surrounded by green plants higher than the windows. A stunned silence was quickly broken by the sounds of evacuation. The crew deployed the slides directly into the corn. Passengers slid down into the chest-high crops, pushing their way through the stalks, some carrying children, others helping strangers, until they reached the clearings around the jet. Drone footage later revealed a surreal scene, a modern airliner resting peacefully among neat rows of crushed corn, looking more like a movie set than a crash site. Miraculously, there were no fatalities. While dozens suffered minor injuries, all 233 occupants survived. The captain and first officer were hailed as heroes, with many comparing their airmanship to the Miracle on the Hudson. Both crews faced a dual engine loss at low altitude and successfully ditched their aircraft in the only available safe space. The investigation confirmed the sequence. Bird remains were found in both engines, and flight data showed the crew acted with precision. There was no mechanical failure and no delay in decision-making. The incident also forced a review of wildlife management around Zhukovsky, highlighting the dangers of waste sites near airports that attract birds. We saw a plane stall and roll into a river beside a bridge in Taipei. A heavy cargo jet slammed down, bounce and flip over at Narita. A 737 that seemed safe at the gate suddenly turned into a fireball. A Russian jet that could not stop before the end of the runway and ended up on a highway. A night approach in fog that finished short of the runway, on a road. A 737 hanging off a muddy Black Sea embankment. Another breaking into 3 pieces at Sabiha Gökçen, a takeoff in Lima that met a fire truck instead of clear concrete. And an Airbus that lost both engines to birds and finished its flight in a cornfield. Those clips are shocking, but they are not random. Behind every few seconds of video there were choices and conditions. Unstable approaches that should have been abandoned, tailwinds that exceeded limits, wet and short runways, confusion with automation, poor coordination between tower and ground vehicles, wildlife that was not kept away from the flight path. Investigators went through each of these cases frame by frame and data point by data point so that pilots, controllers, and airports would not repeat the same mistakes. Flying today is safer because of nights and days like these. Rules on stabilized approaches, go-around decisions, runway safety areas, vehicle crossings, and bird control were written and tightened in the shadow of these accidents. If you have stayed with this story to the end, you are not here just for a few dramatic clips. You care about what actually happened and why. If you want more calm, detailed aviation documentaries like this, you can really help by liking the video, subscribing to Terra Obscura, and sharing it with someone who also wonders how modern aviation became as safe as it is.